Kimberly Murray is going to be joining us for our keynote this morning. She is a member of the Kanisaga Mohawk Nation. She is currently the independent special interlocutor for missing children and unmarked graves and burial sites associated with Indian residential schools. But prior to this role, she was the province of Ontario's first ever Assistant Deputy Attorney General for Indigenous Justice. Many of you may remember her as the Executive Director of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. And for some of us Ontario folks in the room, you probably remember her from her work as a staff lawyer and Executive Director of Aboriginal Legal Services here in Toronto. She really brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise to the topic of the hour, and we're very thankful that she has set aside some time in a very busy schedule to join us this morning. So thank you very much, Kim. Appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Sego Seguego, Kimberly Murray, Young Yats, Ganye Gahaga, Ni Me Ganasatage Wakaho. Good morning, everyone. I introduced myself in Mohawk. I told you my name. I said I come in peace and that I'm Wolf Clan. And I am very honored and looking forward to the conversation, and hopefully I won't take up the whole hour so we can actually have a dialogue. For those that know me, I often don't do what I'm told to do. I was asked to speak about reconciliation and public legal education and how it could further reconciliation. And obviously I would be remiss if I don't talk about my mandate. So I'm hoping that you'll bear with me as I go through some of the work that I've been doing. And I was thinking very closely about how I can incorporate what public legal education can do to help communities that are trying to find the missing children in unmarked burials. So I acknowledge the land, and thank you for the opening words and the acknowledgement of the land. As I said, I'm Mohawk of Ganasatake. I grew up in Montreal, but I've lived in Toronto for almost 30 years. And the Indigenous community in this city is spectacular. So opening and welcoming, they are like my family. I cannot walk anywhere in the city without running into someone that I've met over the years from living here. So I'm very grateful that they've welcomed me into their territory. So I thought what I would do first is I'm going to show you a video. It's from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission when we did our Vancouver gathering. If some of you may recall, the TRC had to host 7 national gatherings. And when we did our gathering in Vancouver, it was the first time that we decided to do an education day. And I thought some of you may have seen this. I've used it in speeches before, but you can always, I've seen it so many times, and it impacts me every time I watch it. It's about 4.5 minutes. And what we did is we brought kids from elementary school and high school to the national gathering and taught them about Indian residential schools. And this is a little documentary about that. So I'm hoping my friends over at that table will hit the play button for me. I hit the green one? Thank you.
We know that among you are the future leaders of this country. Among you are those who are going to govern this land. Among you are those who are going to make important decisions about reconciliation. And you are going to have to come to terms with this history that you're going to hear a little bit about. And we know that's a difficult process, but it all starts with 3 things. You must watch, you must listen, and you must show respect.
It's finally nice that we realize everything and we learn about it, what really happened.
My grandparents, my mom, been through this residential stuff, so I just really wanted to know more about it.
I've learned a lot, actually, considering that my grandma didn't tell me very much or anything. So I've learned what abuse they had to go through. I've learned when it started, how long it was for, when it ended. I've learned a lot.
I want to learn about what happened to my dad when he was in residential school, and want to learn the healing process and what will help with it.
It makes me feel kind of sad for those kids because
because it was torture. You know, it's not fair. They took them away from their homes, so they just here go to that school. I just didn't agree with that. It's just really wrong.
It makes me upset when I think about it, because just knowing what like my dad and his mom had to go through, it's really hard like to deal with, I guess. I don't know. It bothers me a lot, and now I realize like why my dad drank so much when I was a little kid, I guess.
It'll kind of change the way I think about things, like how it would like affect someone's life and their kid's life for like generations. That's one of the worst things I kind of did.
I hope events like this just are able to bring closure to a lot of horrible things that happened, and I hope a lot of people now recognize that crime happened and that we need to make amends for it.
I'll never forget this day, because today is the first day they ever told us about residential schools, and if I ever see anyone that's Aboriginal, I'll ask them if they can speak their language, because I think speaking their language is a pretty cool thing.
I like being around this. I like hearing the drums and seeing everybody else and learning about new nations and all these new languages I have not heard of yet.
I think we should start a dance crew and start bringing back our culture, start speaking our language, and everyone should just treat each other equal.
Our traditions carried on and passed down so that all our younger generations, and so that my baby knows what happened in the past to her ancestors, and so that she can just keep bringing our tradition forward and passing it on to her kids and their kids and everything.
And I hope that something like this never happens again anywhere in the world. And the importance of letting people know is so that it doesn't happen again. And it's good for the younger generation to know that, so that we all treat each other as equal.
I wanted to show that video because it shows the power of education and educating people. I'm concerned that this country right now has a lot of old people like me, my age, that don't know as much as the children in this video. On this slide, I've put some of the things that those young people said from that one day of public education. It was torture. It was not fair. It was really wrong. It was the worst thing that Canada ever did. They hope that people recognize that crimes happened and we need to make amends. That everyone should treat each other as equal, and the importance of letting people know so that it doesn't happen again. You know, I have 2 kids. I used to go to court when I litigated. And my daughters, I used to put them in the car seat in the back of my car and take them to daycare. They always knew when I had to go to court because I have my abs and my vest on. And my kids would always say, "What's the case about today, Mommy?" And I, of course, would tell them about whatever terrible human rights atrocity I was going to court about for Indigenous people at Aboriginal Legal Services of Toronto. And it was always my kids that would say, "Well, that's not fair." And I always thought to myself, how come our judicial system and our politicians don't have that same barometer of fairness and right and what's right and what's wrong? And we see that in these young citizens, young Canadians, just from one day, how they understand that. So I want to talk a little bit about truth, as I said, and I promise I will try and give some tips about public legal education around the missing children and unmarked graves. So it's really important when we talk about reconciliation that, and I know you've all heard this, that truth has to come first. And unfortunately, in this country, we're not done sharing truth. We're not done learning the truth. The TRC had a specific mandate and wrote a whole volume on missing children and unmarked burials, but it didn't have the resources to do the full investigation that's required to determine how complex the issue of the children in unmarked graves is across this country. And so the questions that we still don't have answers to is how many children died in Indian residential schools. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in the work that we did, we had identified through the limited records that we had over 3,200 children that died in the institutions. And those children that died, we found information in historical records from the churches and from Library and Archives Canada. All those records have not been produced yet. Right now, there's a working group working to go through and collect more government records. We're told millions of records are still to be released and provided to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. We know a number of the churches didn't provide their records. We know some records are actually in the Vatican. We know some records are in England with the Protestant entities. So we know that these numbers of children that died are going to increase. The other thing that I always need to remind people is that only Canada and the churches to the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement had to provide records to the TRC. The provinces didn't. And the provinces are the ones that have death certificates. The provinces are the ones, and the territories are the ones that have the permits for burials. And so we called on all the provinces and territories to provide their records. Some did. Some didn't. Some still haven't. Some just recently provided their records. And there are documentation, there is documentation in those records that show that children are buried at the Indian Residential School on the grounds. It says it right on the death certificate. So we have a lot of truth to find out how many children died. We don't know where they're buried, all of them. We know that many of the Indian residential schools were built right in the blueprint. They had the outline where the cemetery would be. They built them with a cemetery, knowing that kids were going to die and they were going to bury them there. It was the policy to not return the children home if they died. But we don't know where all those cemeteries exist because of lost records, because of lost memories, because of when they closed down the residential school, some of them, they actually exhumed the bodies of the church people and left the children buried and built on top of them or paved over them. The TRC talks about a couple of examples in volume 4. And we don't know where all the unmarked graves are. You probably asked me what's the difference between where are they buried and where the unmarked graves are. What we're learning is that children are buried all over the country in cemeteries, in unmarked graves, close to the institutions. And not are they only in unmarked graves, they're in mass graves. Meaning, and there's no international definition of what a mass grave is. I know you're all immediately thinking about the Holocaust and thinking about those graves, but internationally under the Bournemouth Protocol, a mass grave is any grave that has more than one person in it. So when I say mass graves, they're common graves. I wrote in my interim report about a place just over in the eastern townships of Montreal in Quebec. There are 30 children in 4 mass graves from an institution. And we can exhume, we have some information of parents found their child there. They can exhume their child because of all the other children that are in the mass grave. And we don't have permission from the other parents. So it's much more complicated than the Indian residential schools. Children were transferred between institutions to Indian hospitals, sanatoriums, reformatories, provincial mental health organization institutions. I mean, in this province in Ontario, we had what we called the Ontario hospitals. They were mental health hospitals. People are buried at those institutions. There are cemeteries associated, unmarked burials, and really poor record keeping, unfortunately. So I just wanted to share a little bit about those truths. I'm going to talk about when Tk'emlúps happened, the government of Canada immediately came out and announced that they were going to appoint a special interlocutor for missing children in unmarked burials. I know none of us ever thought that there would be such a position in this country. And it took about a year for the Department of Justice and Crown Indigenous Relations to consult with Indigenous leadership about what the mandate would include. And so as appointed for a 2-year mandate, I'm over a year into it. It ends next June. And I've been asked to make recommendations for a new legal framework to protect the burial grounds of the missing children. We do not have a national legislation like they have in the United States to protect artifacts and remains of Indigenous people. When I started my job, I worked with survivors and elders and discussed how we would approach the work. And so I'm just going to share some of the guiding principles that they developed with me. The first is that the bodies and spirits of missing children must be treated with honor, respect, and dignity. And that's so important because the children weren't treated with honor, respect, and dignity when they were taken to the Indian residential schools. They weren't treated with honor, respect, and dignity when they died. And they weren't treated with honor, respect, and dignity when they were buried in these unmarked graves and in mass common graves. The next guiding principle is that survivors must be honored and acknowledged for raising public awareness of the truths of unmarked burials. Like I said, the TRC wrote a whole volume on missing children in unmarked graves. In that volume, it actually identifies examples of when the remains of children have been found, were washed up when rivers flooded. I'm pointing to the guy here from Alberta. In Dumbo, there's an example in Dumbo where the remains of the children wash up when the river flooded. And so we have known for a long time that there are burials on the grounds of Indian residential schools. Survivors have been saying it for years, for decades. They came to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and they told over and over again the issue of unmarked burials, of missing children, having seen children one day and being gone the next. We heard from survivors that had to dig the graves as children. They were the ones that had to dig the graves of their own colleagues, other children in the institutions. So we have to honor those survivors because nobody was listening and they've been saying it for so long. Just recently, the former Attorney General, Minister Lametti, spoke at one of our gatherings and he said, that Canada wasn't listening, but they're listening now. And I do hope that's true. The third guiding principle is that Indigenous families and communities have a right to know what happened to their children who died while in the care of the state and the churches. They have a right to know what happened to the children. And that right to know, that right to the truth is an internationally recognized legal right for victims of mass human rights atrocities. They have a right to know, and that's why this work has to happen and continue to happen until we find every missing child and every record is turned over. That victim's right to know the truth means that Canada and the state has an obligation to facilitate that truth and to not get in the way of finding that truth. And I say this, Canada is not living up to that obligation right now. There's more that needs to be done. The next guiding principle is that the search for unmarked burials and the recovery of missing children must be governed by Indigenous laws, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, and the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child. We know, actually, this is like Indigenous laws and the UN Declaration are in my mandate, in my OIC. So I was really happy that that was included. We know that Indigenous nations across the country have their own laws that govern govern the protocols around burial, around commemoration of remains, around family, around kinship. We know that the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People has a number of articles that speak directly to the right that Indigenous people have in relation to their ancestors and the protection of their ancestors. And so we're not living up to these conventions as a country, and we need to do more to facilitate these rights and obligations that are embedded in these laws. The final guiding principle is that the searches and investigations must follow the truth. And I talked about this a little bit already. This means that we have to trace the movement of the child, the forced transfer of the child. We have funding right now from Canada, from provinces, to help communities search the grounds of Indian residential schools recognized under the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. So you know the number, there's 144 with the Anderson settlement. There's a list of institutions that communities asked to be added to the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. It's 80 pages, this list, because kids were taken to these other institutions, as I said. There's no funding for communities to search Indian hospital grounds. There's no funding for communities to search reformatories. Right here in Ontario, we have St. John's and St. Joseph's, and we believe that there's a burial ground at St. Joseph's, which was a provincial reformatory. In Quebec, there's a place called Cecil Butters Memorial Hospital, a home for disabled children. Canada was paying Miss Butters $7 a day, $2 more than the province, so she was targeting Indigenous kids to get more money. Indigenous children from the United States were taken to that institution. Kids from northern Manitoba were taken to that institution in southern Quebec. There are at least 5 cemeteries associated with that institution. Records of kids dying at a high rate. We have to trace the movement of the kids. They were taken from Indian residential schools to these other institutions. We have a family from Northern Ontario right now trying to exhume their child who's buried in Southern Ontario. He was transferred from 5 different institutions, and he was taken from his home by the Indian agent as a child, taken to Indian residential school, went to 3 different Ontario hospitals, and ended up in a hospital for kids with epilepsy. He died at 21, was buried. He has a headstone with the wrong name on it. His family was never told where he was. We finally found him. Canada won't pay to exhume that body because it wasn't an Indian residential school that he died in. That's not fair. I found all the records of the Indian agent actually approving the transfer of that child. So now the family's negotiating with the province of Ontario to see if they'll pay to exhume that child. And they're probably going to have to wait till next year because the winter's coming and they won't be able to rebury him up at home. So it's really important that we follow the truth and not have Canada restrict us to the settlement agreement institutions because we know that there are many more. This is a map. You have internet, you can go to Canadian Geographic, and this actually is a screenshot of the map from December, so it looks a little bit different now because more institutions have been added. It shows you where searches have happened at Indian residential schools and other sites, or where they're currently happening. There's information on some of them. You can click on the bubble there, and it'll pull up the institution, and it'll provide the information about what their findings were, or if they're still in the process of doing their investigation. And so, as I said, it's evolves the map as new information comes forward and new communities get funding, more communities get funding and start doing the searches. The Indian hospitals are on here and other institutions. Okay, so TRC, I put these calls to action up, but as you know, there were 94 calls to action that the TRC made. So many of the calls to action speak about education and the need for education. I just pulled these two up because these are the ones related to the Federation of Law Societies and law schools. And they're pretty much the same. But the TRC thought it was really important that lawyers receive appropriate cultural competency training, which includes the history and legacy of residential schools, the UN Declaration, treaties, Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relations. We know that. We know that Alberta didn't want to have that, to pick it on Alberta. We know Alberta tried to stop that mandatory training around this. But I think that this type of training, everybody needs to have this type of training. All Canadians. Many of the calls to action in the education chapter of the reconciliation volume speak about the need to change curriculum. And unfortunately, post-TRC, a lot of undoing good work was done by different provincial governments. During the life of the TRC, a number of provinces and territories started to create mandatory curriculum, and the TRC calls for mandatory curriculum in schools about Indian residential schools. One by one, the provinces, as governments changed, they started to not make it mandatory or just drop the curriculum altogether. And so I don't have a clear picture in my mind right now of what's happening in all the provinces and territories. I know that Ontario, when Doug Ford was elected, he immediately canceled the council, the Aboriginal Advisory Council that was working on the curriculum that was going to be mandatory. But now more recently, they've come out and said they're going to make mandatory curriculum. We'll see. We'll see. But so wherever you're from across the country, you should think about, look and see what the education ministries have done around mandatory curriculum. Because as I said, that's the calls to action that the TRC has asked for. In June of the summer, I released an interim report. It's on my website if you care to read it. And in my interim report, I identified 12 common concerns that communities have expressed to me as they do this sacred work of looking for the children. I'm not going to speak about all 12. I've highlighted in red, that's more for me, because I think that there's some things that public legal education can support communities in this way. And I use the term common concerns because that's in my mandate document, that's in my OIC. But people don't come to me and say, this is my common concern, but this is Canada instructed me to report on the common concerns. So of course, you've all heard about the access and destruction of records. So we have kind of a map, between the provinces in Canada with their ATIP, their access to information and privacy laws, and then we have the provincial laws around freedom of information and protection of privacy. Communities don't understand how to navigate those pieces of legislation. And more importantly, they also don't understand that most, I think, all of these pieces of legislation have a clause that says you can release information if it's in the public interest. I can't see, we need to get that information out to communities to start arguing that. And because right now, as they're trying to get records from Canada, from the provinces, from universities, they're receiving documentation that's all redacted. So there's like this whole piece around access to information that we have to deliver public education to Indigenous people about that. Because in my view, and I'm going to be writing about this, so you might wait till my final report to do your PLE around it. But in my view, it is in the public interest to release these records of the children. It is in the public interest to release the information about what hospital they were taken to and how they died. And it's important for Indigenous data sovereignty. They come together, they're hand in hand. Unfortunately, the public interest in that term has always been the public interest of colonial settlers and white people, and hasn't served Indigenous people well. There's a couple of cases that have come out. There's one in Ontario. His name is Schuyler Williams. He was a land defender, and he was charged for breaching an injunction to stay off the land that was being developed. And recently, a judge dropped the charges or stayed on his sentencing, stayed them. He stayed them. I can't remember what he did, but he didn't get sentenced. And he said it was in the public interest to not put him in jail and to drop these charges. And he said the public interest he was considering was the Haudenosaunee public interest, Indigenous people's public interest, the Great Law of Peace. He considered all those things when he was determining the public interest. And so we need to think about what that means when we think about these legislations that are blocking the truth. When we have international obligations as a state to release this information. We can't continue to allow Canada and the provinces to hide behind these colonial legislations to block the truth. The next common concern is access to and protection of the sites. This is mostly in relation to the lands that are privately owned. Some of you may have seen what's happening in Brandon with the Brandon Indian Residential School. That residential school grounds was transferred when the institution closed, was transferred from the federal government to the provincial government, to the municipal government, and now it's privately owned. And it's a campground, an RV, recreational vehicle campground. There are two or three known cemeteries on these grounds. The campground itself, we know there's a cemetery there. People were camping on top of the cemetery. We actually know a number of the kids that are buried there. The Girl Guides had put up a fence to protect those grounds. The Girl Guides raised money to put up a fence and do commemoration. That fence is gone now. And the private landowner was renting out that parcel of land for people to park on. And the community continues to be trying to negotiate with this landowner, we're hopeful now because Wab Kinew is the new premier of Manitoba, but the province, yay, spoke to him yesterday about this, really hopeful that we'll get something done because the province, who has the legislation and authority to do something, was not willing to act. And it's been sitting there. So I highlight that in red because we have all this complicated legal system in the provinces and territories around burial grounds and cemeteries. We have these Cemeteries Act, burial legislation that speak about what happens if you find bones, if you find remains. And people don't understand all these legislations and how they work together. And especially Indigenous people don't understand this. Like, you know, do you go to the coroner? Do you go to the police? Do you go to the municipal or to the provincial government? How do you stop development on these lands? These are all really important pieces of legal information that communities don't have. You know, if you know what website to go to with the province, you can read a little bit about it, but it's not in plain language that lay people can necessarily understand. So that's a big piece, and I'll be writing about that too. The next one that I highlighted in red was the shortcomings of existing investigation processes. And so I hear over and over again, we can't go to the RCMP. They were the ones that took the kids. We can't go to the provincial police. They were the ones that were called to pick up the kids when they ran away. They were the ones that did the failed investigations when we went to them and said we were sexually abused. And so there's no trust with the police, but there's also a misunderstanding of the death investigation system. People don't understand the difference between a coroner's investigation, a coroner's death investigation, and a criminal investigation. And what does that mean when it becomes a criminal investigation? You know, coroners have all kinds of powers under their legislation when they're doing a death investigation, but they can't use those powers if it turns into a police investigation, because then we fall under the criminal code and you have all the rights of the accused and you have to go get your warrants, and you can't just show up as the coroner and say, I'm taking these records. And so there's a real need for people to understand how a death investigation and how the systems work together and what the differences are with those powers and those rights and what they can do. The last two I'm going to speak about, the increase in denialism. This seems to be the one that all the media seems to really want to talk about. We have seen an increase in denialism. We saw denialism when the TRC was operating, and we were seeing an increase in denialism since Kamloops happened. Every time a community makes an announcement of their findings, we're seeing people speaking out saying it's a hoax, this mass grave hoax, it's dig them up. I write in my report how actually people showed up into Kamloops with shovels wanting to go on the ground and start digging to see if there were remains there. And so, you know, NDP MPP Leah Gazan in Manitoba has spoken about this, and she's suggesting, and I'm hopeful that she's going to table a bill, I'm hoping, in November to amend the criminal code to make it an offense to incite hate against Indian residential school survivors, and to sort of downplay, misstate Indian residential schools. So I have said in my interim report, and I say this often, is that it shouldn't be Indigenous people that have to counter the denialism. Denialism is not an Indigenous issue. It's a Canadian issue. It's a settler issue. And so we've been calling on Canadians, the government, the churches, to speak up and to put a stop to the denialism. You know, I say this a lot. Canada has the evidence. The churches have the evidence. And that evidence is being hidden because of our privacy laws. Even the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, which was supposed to be the Indigenous archive, you can't access records there. They're restricted because of the Manitoba provincial legislation that was created for it. So we need individuals, Canadians, institutions to counter the denialism and put information out there that says this happened. An example, just recently, the University of Manitoba, Sean Carlton, and I've forgotten the name of the other gentleman, he's a PhD student. They just released a report to counter denialism. They took up my challenge to Canadians. And they took on they did a study of media and how they were reporting on unmarked graves and this idea that it's a hoax. And I encourage all of you, if you Google it, it'll come up to see what they did to respond to denialism. And then the last one is accountability and justice that I'll speak about. Everywhere I go, communities talk about there's been no accountability and there's been no justice. The settlement agreement wasn't about accountability, it wasn't about justice. And so the TRC in its final report has an appendix where they identify, because they were only allowed to identify people that were convicted. There was They were restricted in their mandate. They weren't allowed to name offenders unless they were convicted. There's an appendix in the final report that lists everybody that's been convicted. It's a short list. We can add the 90, well, how old was she? 92-year-old that just got charged 2 weeks ago. 20-year investigation of a nun. And they just charged her, the OPP just charged her. We know that woman's not going to go to jail. Like, we know what's going to happen. No one sees that as accountability and justice. What I've been hearing is, and what I say is that the existing criminal and death investigation systems actually weren't created for the situation that we're seeing right now in relation to unmarked graves. They weren't created to respond to mass and systemic human rights violations. And so that's the problem that we have with our police investigations, our coroner's investigations, our criminal processes, the inability to sort of charge institutions and focusing on the individual rather than the state. And so, I was just at a gathering yesterday and the day before in Manitoba, and the name of the gathering was, the title of the gathering was Unmarked Graves. I forget the title now. Unmarked Graves, naming it as genocide. It was something like that. So, they were calling it genocide. And so there's problems with genocide. And this is something that I think you can all do as well, is when we look at the Genocide Convention and the understanding of genocide, when that convention was created, Indigenous people weren't part of that process. Indigenous perspectives weren't included when they were creating the Genocide Convention. And, there was this whole dialogue when I was working at the TRC about genocide is the Holocaust and only the Holocaust only. And there are some competing scholars that talk about genocide. And so we need to decolonize the definition or how it's interpreted of genocide. And I think we've been moving forward in that regard. There's a lot of new academic scholars that are speaking about this, but there's a difference. Like, if we talk to kids, those kids that we were watching, and when you think back of your own education, when we think about what we were taught about genocide, is these mass killings that happen really quickly. But the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry talk about colonial genocide and how it's a slow process with the long-term goal of eliminating a peoples. And that's what's happened in Canada. And some will say it's still happening. I heard that yesterday, that it's still happening. And so, better understanding of the term genocide and what it means. Crimes against humanity. I think most Canadians don't know what that is. They hear the term, but they don't know what the legislation says. I put the offenses up that are included as crimes against humanity. Every single one of these crimes happened in Indian residential school. Every single one of these. There's no denying that. I'll just leave it up for a second. So you can see, we need some education around crimes against humanity. Enforced disappearance of persons. I've been thinking a lot about enforced disappearance. I'll speak about it in a second. Let me just mention the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court, when Kamloops happened, a group of lawyers wrote a letter asking the International Criminal Court to come investigate the burials in Canada. They declined to investigate because they say that their jurisdiction only gets triggered for events that happened after 2002 from the Rome Statute. I think that's a very problematic interpretation of their jurisdiction, especially when we think about the ongoing, I see it as an ongoing crime to block the truth. When we think about the records not being provided, when we think about the state not supporting communities to the extent that they need to be supported to do the searches and to find the missing children, to know the truth. And so the request was that that the International Criminal Court investigate for genocide and crimes against humanity, and they declined. And so there's all these other international instruments that communities aren't aware of. Indigenous people aren't fully aware of all these. They're aware of the UN Declaration. They're not so much aware of these other instruments that exist. And I think that these are mechanisms that we can look to for some kind of justice and accountability for the missing children. And so I want to stop calling them missing children, and I want to call them enforced disappearances. Because the definition of enforced disappearance under the convention, the UN convention, is the arrest, detention, abduction of, or any other form of deprivation of liberty by agents of the state, followed by the concealment of the fate or whereabouts of the disappeared person. And most importantly, a disappeared person and the crime of disappearing people is an ongoing crime until the truth is found. Until you know who died, how they died, where they're buried, until the families and the communities are given that information. And if they're not given that information, the crime is a continuing crime that should be investigated. And so these kids are disappeared. I encourage you to read my interim report. You'll read about the children that have been missing, and the families were looking for 30, 40, 50, in one case, 60 years. I spend most of my days helping families find where their child is buried in a cemetery across this country. And those records, some of those I find on ancestry.com, right? We have families that have gone to Canada, have gone to the churches, have gone to the Indian hospital asking for records and not told where they are. And then we find that there's actually a record that says where the child's buried. They are disappeared. So I just want to go back to denialism. I think I put this out of order. So this is what the TRC said actually about denialism. That's right, I'm triggering my memory. I did this late last night. The TRC said that failing to acknowledge the deliberate genocidal harm inflicted on Indigenous children is a barrier to reconciliation. And that it reinforces a culture of denialism in the Canadian population. So it's really important that we educate Canadians that what happened was genocide, that it is a crime against humanity, that it is enforced disappearance. We need to start speaking that way about the children. We know that, we have this growing movement of people recognizing and acknowledging Indian residential schools as genocide. In the House, all the parties, there was a motion on the House that passed where everyone recognized that it was genocide. The Pope said it was genocide. We need all of Canadians to understand that it's genocide. These are just some of the articles in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People that speak about the importance of having appropriate mechanisms to address justice, redress, and compensation for mass violations of human rights and genocidal harms it has committed. I say that Canada has breached these articles of the declaration. But where do you go? It's a declaration, right? But we do have the UN Declaration Act that Canada enacted not that long ago. And so these are really important things that we need to think about, whether Canada is living up to their obligations under the declaration and the new legislation. So I'm just I got that because I want people to be able to ask questions. So this is from the TRC report. The TRC said that survivors want Canadians to know, to remember, to care, and to change. And they said that Canada's national history must reflect its complex truth so that our children's children and their children will know what happened, as they are the ones that will inherit the responsibility to never ensure that it never happens again. Just like that young woman said in the video that I showed you at the beginning. The TRC said that we have an urgent need in this country to develop historically literate citizens. And I see that's your role, that you can help develop those literate citizens in this country with the public legal education that you're doing. And oh, see, I said it. That was my next slide. So I said it already, counter denialism, support Indigenous communities around their options and remedies. So that's, again, all these international mechanisms that exist, working with Indigenous people so that they understand what's out there. And also in relation to the provincial and territorial laws to protect the burials, because we don't have a national legislation right now. We have to rely on the provincial territorial legislations. And so, you know, if anyone wants to email me, you can email me. I have a chart. Of course, we've done the jurisdictional scan. I have a chart that talks about all the different legislations, pieces of legislation in each province. I know the provinces and territories in the government, and they have been doing some of that work. And some of the provinces are thinking about passing their own, like what we have in the United States, that's a federal law, the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act. There are some provinces that are thinking about doing that provincially, because, as you know, it's complicated with the division of powers. But these are some of the things I think you can do. So there's my email. If you want that chart, I share. I'm an open book. And I'll just stop there because I think there's time for questions still. Yeah, okay. And I thank everyone for listening, and I hope I gave you some things to think about in the work that you do as educators. So now
It's working. Oh,
Oh,
there you go.
there.
Good morning. Thank you for your wonderful remarks, Kimberly. I'm Dom Bautista. I'm with AC Friends of Court. I hail from Vancouver. Beautiful land where the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people live.
Yes.
Last Thursday, my team and I happened to be in Kamloops, and on a whim, on a Friday morning, we actually decided that we would visit the Kamloops Indian Residential School. We did not have an appointment, so we stood outside just to have a look. And outside the school, I don't know if any of you have been to that school, we basically looked at it. It's a typical school. There was a wing for the young ladies to sleep in, and there was another wing where the young men were housed. And then there was the school in the middle. But we stood outside. And I wanted to read this to you because I'm hoping you can shed some light to it. The final sentence says, children attending the Kamloops Indian Residential School experienced extreme isolation and segregation. So my question is, and I asked my colleagues how interesting it was that there was no mention of the abuse that the children suffered while attending the school. And, you know, when we spoke to the local community, everyone talked about the wonderful way how the Kamloops has been reclaimed by the Indigenous community. But this sign is what greeted us outside its doors. Silent. Mm-hmm. Denial, maybe in your words, of the abuse and the resulting deaths that came from having been forced to stay in the school. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Is that from the PLEAC?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, that's from the PLEAC. So a couple of things come to mind around that. You know, a lot of the commemorative plaques that are at some of the Indian residential schools. And by the way, I use the term, I call them Indian residential schools. That is not to diminish or not recognize that Métis and Inuit were also taken to the institutions, but that was what they were called. That was what the legislation called them. And I use that term because it shows how racist it was. right? So because people are saying, oh, the residential schools or the boarding schools. These were institutions for Indigenous children. And, you know, when I worked in the province of Ontario, when St. Kamloops happened, the Indigenous Affairs Ontario started calling them Indigenous residential schools. And I was like, what, we're trying to be respectful of Indigenous people from a racist policy that was in operation for over 100 years. So when I footnote that in my report. And there are a lot of survivors that want us to say Indian residential schools for that purpose. But we know Métis and Inuit children were in these institutions, and for the Métis, they were in other institutions that were provincially operated that have not been recognized. Isla Cross is a big one. But so back to the plaque. So I don't know the answer, but I'm going to assume it's because it's in the community, survivors are coming, and they want to be trauma informed in what they put on the plaque when people come. But I encourage you to read the TRC report, to go to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation website, and you will be able to see survivor statements that talked about their physical and sexual abuse. You will read about it in the final report. You'll see the testimony. You will hear the testimony. You know, I hear this all the time in British Columbia, more than anywhere else, about babies being thrown in the incinerators. I had a gathering in Vancouver, and I heard that over and over and over again. And, you know, when we think about crimes against humanity, that's one of them as well. And that's a truth that we're probably never going to be able to prove because those incinerators are gone. But that's only one piece. The commemorative piece is recognizing the survivors that were taken to that institution. And I know that with the funding from the federal government, newer, more updated commemorative plaques are being established, adding the names of the children that were taken to those institutions, adding the names of the children that died in the institution. So thank you for that. And thank you for mentioning that the institution still stands. For those that are in Ontario, just down the road in Brantford, you can go visit the Mohawk Institution, longest operating Indian residential school in the country. It still stands. It's a museum now. They do tours, they do online tours, and you can actually really feel what it must have felt like for those kids to be there.
Good morning. My name is Ellen Mullally. I work at Community Legal Information, which is in Epiquet, also known as Prince Edward Island. And firstly, I just want to say thank you, because I learned a lot of new information today. I felt like pretty informed on this topic, but unfortunately there's always more horror, it seems. And one of the things that I found really useful, or like really enlightening in what you were talking about, is talking about it's the boring details sometimes that are getting in the way of sharing the truth. So like the administrative issues, or like the mandate wasn't broad enough to include this word, and how important it is to pay attention to a lot of those details. Because I think in the public, people are like, reconciliation is happening. It is, you know, but it's like behind the scenes and what you're sharing and the blocks between like federal laws and provincial laws and privacy laws. I guess I just want to thank you, because that takes teams and teams and teams of people to work through, and also have the patience and the relentlessness to keep going in search of that truth and justice. So I mainly want to say thank you for everything you shared today.
Thank you. Thank you. I always like to give a little history, because you said you're from PEI. So I met with Chief Bernard, and so just for people to know, there was only one Indian residential school in the Maritimes, and that was Shubenacadie, and those grounds have been searched. But when we think about following the truth, we know that kids from the Maritimes were taken to all these other institutions that will require searching. And there's a couple in the Maritimes that are very concerning to me. They called them the Interprovincial Home for Women, and young women were sentenced to, you know, if they were terrible. I won't even say what the language of the legislation said at the time because it's so offensive. But kids were taken to these institutions and they died. I recently helped a woman who was transferred there in New Brunswick to one of them in New Brunswick. They were operated by the churches. She was part of the Allen Memorial Institute experiments that Dr. Ewan Cameron did on LSD. She speaks about burials happening behind the Allen Memorial Hospital in Montreal. But she ended up in New Brunswick and in one of these interprovincial homes that were in the Maritimes. And she was raped and she has memory of having a child, and we found the child, but we found 2 children. One was buried in an unmarked grave in New Brunswick, and we went to the burial site and she did her ceremonies. The other one was taken by the Misericord Hospital, and we're now working with provincial adoption disclosure to try and find that child. He would be in his 60s if he's still alive. She's in her 80s. And she has no memory of any of this because of the experiments that were being done on her. But for the First Nations in the Maritimes, it was Shubenacadie, but they were also sent to Quebec and all these other institutions. And, there's a lot of work to do in that area.
Good morning. I'll echo everybody's thank you for that because it was great. And thank you very much for showing the film, which was very moving. And I know some of those kids, and I acted for one of their parents many years ago. So it was really moving to me to see them. I did want to ask, so does your, perhaps in your interim report, have you got a catalog or jurisdictional scan of what those actual laws that have stood in the way, those laws in respect of burial cemeteries and graveyards, exhumations and burials, that type of thing, which would be helpful to people who are interested in this, and to Indigenous communities that are just kind of stumped sometimes before they even go to see a lawyer or that.
Yeah, thanks for your comment. And I just also, you reminded me, though that film, and there's all kinds of other films, they're on the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation website, which is not user friendly. If you're looking for a film to show at a public education event, there's all kinds. We did these little mini documentaries at all our national gatherings. Call me, I'll get you a film. There's all different times. There's up to 20 minutes. There's like 7 minutes, 4 minutes, all different topics. And I can teach you all how to get to it because the National Center doesn't do a good job at that. We do have a jurisdictional, I forgot your question for a second. We do have a jurisdictional scan, but it's the one I have right now, and obviously we're working because we're writing our final report and are identifying the barriers. The scan that I have right now just identifies the provisions of the different legislations that exist. That column of the barriers and how it's not working is not in my current chart, but it will be what we'll be writing about in the final report that will be released in June. And I also, from the woman from PEI, I had written down, I just wanted to say something about how communities are trying to get away from saying reconciliation. Of course, I still use the term reconciliation, having worked at the TRC, but what I'm saying now is that we don't have proper full reparations to have reconciliation. And so, when I write about this in my final report, I've sort of, in my interim report, I foreshadow what we're going to say about reparations and the different, I identified 10, I think, elements that should be included in the reparation process for us to get to reconciliation. I don't know why I wrote that down. You must have said the word reconciliation. So it reminded me to mention that. So I encourage people to look at that list.
Hello, my name is Emily, also from the area. I'm really interested in the idea of countering denialism. And it's not so much, maybe not a question for anyone with ideas. The mental gymnastics that you can go through to even in the face of truth. ways to sort of break through when someone is in denial and like interested in being in. Yeah, so even if we do get some part of the truth or all the truth, like ways to yeah, to do that education in a way that's effective. And so I'm just sort of interested in strategies if anyone has any ideas and other ways to break through, I suppose.
Yeah, thanks for that. I was having a hard time hearing you, but I think I got the question. We've been doing research. My office has been doing research and talking to international experts around memory laws and how memory laws have worked or haven't worked around the world. And so, you know, memory laws are to stop denialists. And we talk about the criminalization and how we want to amend the criminal code to make it a crime to incite hate around Indian residential schools. But what we've learned in the academic literature and, you know, our international scan is that it only works when we increase the public education. It's not enough for us to just criminalize or go after people in civil court. And so that's why it's so important for this gathering to think about how you can add to that education. My very first chapter, unless the editor tells me to change it, which I'm not going to, I don't think. My very first chapter for the final report is called Sites of Truth. And that strategy of putting that in the first chapter is speaking to the denialism. And in that chapter, we're showing the actual photographs of the blueprints of the cemeteries. We're showing letters of the principal writing to Canada saying, cemetery's full, we're going to start burying them across the road. We're going to put examples of provincial death certificates that say this child is buried at the Indian Residential School Cemetery, signed by the principal or signed by the Indian agent. So we're putting all that right up front. And so I think as a strategy is to like think about like locally, if you're in British Columbia, I mean, you're lucky you have the Dialogue Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and they're doing a lot of this stuff, is to try and engage with them about how you, in the public legal education world, can work with them to further sharing information about the truth to address denialism. And, you know, it's just about speaking up, right? Educate yourself and say, well, what does this mean then, you know, to address it? Just for the last thing, I know we're probably out of time. I did a talk for the Law Society of Ontario. It was National Indigenous National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, sorry. It was on Zoom and there were 1,000 registrants. And I did a presentation about my work. I had warned the Law Society and said, please don't make the Q&A public. We had a moderator that was going to do the Q&A because I have these trolls following me around the country and sending me hate mail. And you should see like, this is a Law Society event. The hate and the comments that they put in the chat, nobody could see it but me and the facilitators. The woman that was the bencher or governing, she's part of our governing board. I don't know if everyone calls them benchers across the country, was an Indigenous woman and she was visibly upset. And I said to the Law Society, it's not me, I can handle it. Like, this is my job. I deal with it every day. But it's so traumatic for other people and for community members. And I could see on the Zoom, she was visibly traumatized from having to look at these comments. I saved them, I have them. I'm going to be releasing them, hopefully when we have the private members bill tabled, because it's real. It's coming from our own profession, which is very disturbing to me. So speak up, speak up, speak up, speak up is what I would say.